what walked me out of anorexia was having something worth living for. Here, I think the time it takes to attend a conversation, to read a book, I don't take it for granted. There are many conversations I want to attend and many books I want to read I haven't gotten to yet, so I just really appreciate that you take the time to be here. I hope to make it worth your time. I'm going to say a number of words, read a little bit from the book, but then hopefully by 1:30 we're going to open it up for a Q&A. So if as I'm speaking or reading, questions cross your mind, please feel free to jot them down, or if you have a better memory than I do, recall them, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time to talk through some of those. So again, thank you so much for being here. I had a chance to meet most of you, but not all of you, so I look forward to hearing from the rest of you. I'm a local in my own way. I haven't lived here in a very long time, but I think the first time I sat in a classroom like this, I was 6 years old with my mother, who had started her studies at Montana State. I moved here first in 1985 and then stayed on for quite a while and kind of moved back and forth for years, and have made a habit of returning to Bozeman and the Gallatin Valley for decades since. So I love this place. If at some point you find it worth reading and you get your hands on the book, you'll find a lot of reference to this particular area and Montana State specifically as well. So it's really an honor to be here. We are actually, I say we, Mitchell Cassiano, my partner in crime on the book, my assistant on the whole book tour, has been traveling with me for the last month. We launched the book at Harvard a month ago tomorrow, and have been traversing the country ever since, bringing this conversation everywhere from Alaska to Atlanta to New York and many places in between. So we hope, again, you find it worth your time, and I look forward to your questions. So by way of introduction, thank you, Cassidy. Thanks to Dr. Hayes, Montana State University, of course, the entire Honors President's Lecture Series crew that's making this possible. We really appreciate it. Every single event takes a lot of work behind the scenes. Thank you. It's very kind of you. This book, and the conversation more importantly than the book, is really the story of my journey through anorexia, and I think more importantly, a call to action, as you heard in the introduction, to change our current perspective on what anorexia is, and as a result, how best to treat it. A little background on anorexia. How many of you feel pretty familiar with anorexia as a concept? Oh, how cool is that? Oh, love an informed audience. This is why it's great to tour universities. All right. So some of this might be familiar to you, and some of this might be the first time you've been hearing it. But anorexia nervosa was first classified in the DSM in 1952. But it has existed for millennia before then. It was the only eating disorder classified in the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, which is how the American Psychological Association says this is a real thing, and you can diagnose it and get reimbursed for treating it, or be allowed to, medicate it or whatever. So anorexia was the first eating disorder recognized in the DSM. Now, of course, many others are recognized alongside it. Then and now, 70 years later, it's the mental illness with the highest mortality rate. That surprises some. You all are so well educated, you may already know this, but 10% of anorectics die within 10 years, 20% within 20 years, and the mortality rate of anorexia is 2 to 5 times the next deadliest mental health disorder, which is schizophrenia. So it's a very scary monster that affects women at 10 times the rate of men. I find all of that very interesting. It's a fascinating soup of knowledge, and we'll kind of get into how I interpret that, and I'd love to hear a bit more from you all, how you might interpret that as well. The average age of onset is age 15 to 24, though that is beginning to skew younger, unfortunately. And as I mentioned, of those who don't die, only about a third fully recover what they might call a life worth living. The rest continue to battle the disorder and its myriad physical catastrophes for the rest of their life, which is typically shortened in duration and severely reduced in quality. So the history of anorexia, how we got here. Right now, it's treated as a, put it this way. It's treated as a compulsion toward, anorexia right now is treated as a compulsion toward control. Okay, so the story that I vehemently disagree with, but the story that is the party line at the moment is that you have a young woman whose life is starting to spiral out of control in different ways. We call this adolescence. It's a normal shift but evidently for anorectics it's particularly dramatic, the story goes. And the anorectic behavior, which is self-starvation to the point of death for many, is a desire to control the world around oneself. I disagree. I think that anorexia is the shrinking, physical and otherwise, to this space that you feel like you're allowed to take up in your life. And the size of that space is defined by others, including society and potentially individuals in your world. We can talk more about that, and I'll get into that in the book as well, but it's a strong difference from how it's currently perceived. Before I go any further, any immediate questions or thoughts on that? No? Okay. So how the current perception of anorexia as being the behavior of a control freak who's potentially manipulative and certainly incredibly difficult affected me in my journey is that I found a break in trust immediately with those most immediately charged with my support and well-being, whether from a parental family perspective or from a medical or therapeutic treatment perspective. This is why I think it's really important to recognize the difference between what the psychiatric party line is and what another idea of what it may be is. How I have the hubris to bring such a strong shift in perspective forward is that in spite of the incredible efforts of many decades, if not centuries, of work in researching this space, from an epidemiological perspective, we've gotten nowhere. So the mortality rates are as high as they have always been. The number of folks in terms of percent of population, we're sitting at about 1%, has not decreased. And when external factors are added to the soup, you see a dramatic increase in eating disorders. For example, they increased to 70% over the pandemic. That's not a direct number for anorexia, but the umbrella of eating disorders increased 70% during the pandemic. So I fear that the progress of anorexia will continue unabated unless we address what I think is the false axiom of control and bring to bear the patient experience in changing the conversation around what it is and what it isn't, because I believe it holds hope for changing the outcomes that we're looking at right now, which are actually pretty awful. I expected to run into a lot of headwinds with this idea, as one typically does when you say, hey, wait a minute, I'm not sure we're looking at this right. I think it's important to do it with a lot of sincere humility and recognition of the efforts that have been made. And that's why I say epidemiologically we've not gotten anywhere. Individually, obviously there are many, I'm sure hundreds or if not thousands or more patients who can say, well, I sure did, right? So I think some have been able to find a life that feels very worth living and have silenced the voice of anorexia in their head. But for those others, I think, again, we can do better. The good news is the idea has actually received a lot of incredible support. So Dr. Thomas Insel is the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health. He was for the years 2002 to 2015. His own daughter battled anorexia, during which he felt completely helpless to support her, which he speaks about in his most recent book, the national bestseller titled Healing. And he said that this book is not only an inspiring narrative, but for anyone who loves someone struggling with an eating disorder, this book will shine a light on both the ferocity of the disorder and what it takes to triumph. So when I read a section here pretty soon, you'll hear a bit about the ferocity of the disorder. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about one example of what it might take to move beyond it. So why are we stuck in this current narrative around control? When you're talking about young women at the age of adolescence, I think it's not a coincidence that a highly masculine organization, because for a long time, of course, only men could practice psychiatry, treating very young women who generally in society, and unfortunately even to this day in so many ways, are marginalized. Certainly the voices are marginalized. I think it's not surprising that the interpretation of the behavior was incorrect, and what I would argue is actually borders on insulting. which leads us to a need to modernize that particular viewpoint. So Dr. Dori Swamy, who heads up the psychiatry department at Duke University Medical School, and is also the former co-chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Mental Health, says it's a powerful call to action for the field to modernize the perception and treatment of anorexia, which impacts more than 80 million women worldwide and carries the highest mortality rate of any mental illness. So a bit of the context of kind of what the book is about and where I'm headed with it before I dive in to read a bit, to give a little more context. Any thoughts or questions? I'm going to just keep talking. So I will read from the introduction and then a bit of chapter 1, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. In the book, I do a couple of things in the structure of the book, or the internal architecture of the book. I start each chapter with a quote, and each chapter title is a compilation of a culinary component and a psychological component. So the initial quote is from Anne Lamott, her beautiful book, Bird by Bird, Some Instructions on Writing and Life. You own everything that happened to you. Tell your stories. If people wanted you to write warmly about them, they should have behaved better. Introduction. Sometimes life shares lessons quietly, employing whispers or birdsong, side glances, or distant memories stirred by the faintest hint of an ancient scent. Lessons in this subtle form come when we are prepared to listen, though we are not always prepared to listen. So life meets us where we are, delivering a more impactful message, more boom, less whisper. History shows that I prefer my lessons to arrive as internalized verbal lashings. At that decibel level, I begin to hear. I practice tuning my ear to the sweeter communiques to spare myself the harsher directives. It is a stumbling, imperfect journey. Anorexia nervosa isolates and kills, like the true predator that it is. Yet contrary to typical predatory behavior, it seeks the strongest, the brightest, the kindest, and the most capable. Anorexia craves the best. So first, it must weaken its prey with the most powerful weapon of all, thoughts. This predator usurps the logical processes of the mind, generating a Mobius loop of self-loathing. Starvation is merely a method, one that can further warp the mental faculties with its endless counting, denial, craving, restriction, allowances, guilt, confessions, and penitence. Anorexia nervosa orchestrates a complex death march of religious proportion. Ideas matter, and they guide behavior. In a state of crisis, expediency may mask the influence of integrated ideas and the belief systems they create. Still, the core of your philosophical underpinnings informs your decisions, no matter how blinded your visibility is into the process. Ideas about identity and worth are a driving force behind behavior and, by extension, personal history. Anorexia wrote several chapters of my story. My consort for many years, the most lethal of the scientifically classified mental illnesses, I know him intimately. This book is not scripture. One cannot simply pluck out a line or passage and assume that it holds an exclusive truth. It doesn't. The book you hold in your hands is a journey of changing perspectives, of the in-the-moment existential truths of one person, me. By my 22nd birthday, I had cheated death twice. I then spent the next 14 years expecting the dark angel to drop in any time to collect on the debt. This book is not intended to provide tips and tricks on how to emaciate oneself. I'm familiar with the mind of the anorectic, and I know that she reads memoirs and attends group therapy sessions, an awful idea for the record, to acquire new and secret methods of successful starvation. While I shed light on the waypoints of my psychological expedition during the throes of my illness and then through my healing odyssey, I will not provide a roadmap into the abyss. My hope is that my own story will meet you where you are on your journey and provide you a satisfying meal, not a self-absorbed and incomprehensible bite. The use of feminine pronouns in reference to the anorectic throughout this book is deliberate. The overwhelming majority of those who suffer from anorexia are women. Of necessity, women worldwide for millennia have become experts at translating information packaged for men for their own practical use, an additional daily burden with too often a significant gap in translational meaning, particularly as relates to one's own health care. This book wishes to reduce the burden on women, to require no gender translation effort from the young women suffering from this life-threatening disorder, to allow for as minimal a gap as possible in relatability. To the extent that other gendered persons suffering from anorexia are able to use the content of this book in translation to gain benefit and insight, it is welcome and embraced. This book seeks to unmask the construction and content of the belief system and the prime mover of the anorectic mind, the predatory monster, the hunter, the voice. In the pages that follow, I hope to remind you in a more gentle form than that of my own experience that we have all been placed upon this small spinning rock to be meaningfully present to one another. Never underestimate your ability to fundamentally alter another person's world. Like you, I love to read for too many reasons to list here, but perhaps the primary one, aside from the feline, curled up, cozy, and consumed quality of a good read, is that I find my humanity again and again in someone else's story. The completely separate existence of another feels profoundly familiar and deeply informative about my own world and my most personal places. I count on this experience and lean into it like an old friend. We fear most what we do not understand. Sharing our stories opens the door to connecting with the other. Woven within each chapter are elements of the culinary and psychological worlds. The point of contact between these two lands is a familiar place for anyone who has tread into the darkly haunted forest of an eating disorder. At the edge of this forest, I speak from a space large enough to hold a comfortable nest, layering branches and strings to create a dense platform on which I can stand, gain perspective, and call for more understanding, adding my birdsong to the cacophony of questions, spoken and silent, and the hope for life-saving answers. Your existence alone, coupled with love, the fewer conditions, the better, patience, more than you think you have, and spacious awareness, soft focus, minimal distractions, holds the potential for the creation of miracles. Go all in on the beauty side of life. Just be prepared for the blissful fallout, because the capacity of the human heart to love is boundless. Seize every opportunity to love boundlessly. The breaking of so great a thing should make a greater crack. William Shakespeare, Antony and Cleopatra. Chapter 1, Salt and Control. On the corner of Sun Valley Road and Main Street sits a bustling bistro. Columns of river rock support exposed brick walls. A bar runs the length of the room, heralding a commitment to regional beer and wine. Bartenders at the ready with a sample or a recommend and a backstory. The best seats in the house are benches built into a wall of windows offering a somewhat occluded view of Mount Baldy, the grand dame of the row of peaks that comprise the Sun Valley Ski Resort. Its size and presence providing perennial comfort to the valley below in the way that only tall mountains can. Covered with a thin cushion, the benches form a U of right angles. Bohemian-flavored throw pillows allow one to burrow in for a protracted and cozy dinner, each additional course securing the prized real estate for another fraction of an hour. Here, I have shared meals with my family, my spouse, my dearest friends. New and lasting friendships have emerged out of conversations with neighboring tables in this three-sided, window-fronted getaway. It is a protected and secluded space, one where more often than not I dine alone, a practice that provides an opportunity to savor and settle, moseying my way through the uniquely sensual experience of a well-orchestrated and executed meal. In these moments, I am nowhere but here, absorbed by the desire to take it all in, to breathe and smell, taste and touch, see and feel the plated art that the chef has deliberately created. I am wide open, all in. It's a lovely exchange of appreciation, which is to say, presence. Sometimes a flash of inspiration prompts me to write a few words in the notebook that I carry always in my handbag. Other times my bench neighbors will be social, and I will oblige. Most often, I hold these moments for myself, for the sole purpose of filling my tired, scattered, deadline-driven mind with such an overload of delightful sensory input that all else fades. It's a reliably edifying and balancing ritual. On one such evening as spring succumbed to summer, when the once vividly white snow at the very top of the governing peak mixed with dirt from May rains, I returned to this dining ritual to peel myself up from feeling stampeded, to become again three-dimensional, to nourish my fading sense of self. With an abundance of irons in the proverbial fire, I needed to withdraw from a few overextending decisions, to recover some guarded space in which to move about freely, and to protect a few pockets of time not bookended by urgency and others' needs. I had become absorbed by the everyday. I had become indistinguishable from my usefulness. A single goblet of an Italian farmhouse red blend lasted all 4 courses: house-made burrata with a wedge of homemade bread, wild yeast leavening Italian wheat, all smothered in the grassiest of olive oils. Mama's salad with globed grapes, kiki arugula, and salty earth pecorino, roasted Brussels with grilled Marcona almonds, sweetened lightly with saba, and the coup de grace, affogato, a homemade vanilla bean gelato-drenched tableside with hot, strong, freshly brewed espresso. A timeless marriage of complementary opposites. At the moment of the first kiss, espresso to gelato, a thermodynamic timer begins. All will soon melt and blend into a lukewarm coffee cream soup. The divine experience of this dessert lies in the instant of friendliness, just beyond the stark distinction, the first melding the curiosity of one substance for another. The dessert derives its name from the Italian word for drowned. My senses still delighted, my mind unburdened. I stepped outside into the cool, early summer evening. Strolling the 3 blocks back to my hotel, the vanilla bean and espresso flavors lingered on the sides of my tongue. Gentle conversations with the neighboring table echoed in my eardrums. Without warning, swooped up from life and dropped unceremoniously onto the battlefield of the mind, I found myself trapped in a psychological flash flood, pressed against invisible walls rising swiftly and jaggedly from the sidewalk like vertical cliffs impossible to climb, a random attack. Memories of simple pleasures experienced only a moment ago were ripped away. The emotional rapids rushed me. There would be no escape. Sobs lashed out of me uncontrollably, submerged by this drowning wave, choking their source with gasps of desperation, until a wail crept out of my laterally stretched face, a melodrama of sorrow, escaping narrowly as a wounded wild animal to the steel jaws of a hateful trap. The sheer force pummeled shudders through my contracted form, and I spun into a free fall toward the depths of misery, of self-hatred, of self-destruction. I lumbered down the stairs from the sidewalk to my room, leaning all of myself into the door, its weight suddenly incomprehensible. Inside, I collapsed into a sinewy heap on the hotel bed. The monster was back. My annihilation, his goal. So alarming were the sounds coming from my shrinking self that soon a knock came at the door. The hotel manager arrived. He was a thoughtful young man who routinely double-checked my reservation to make certain that my room was conveniently located for my furball of a dog, Coco. Traveling this time without my beloved puppy, I still booked the ground floor, sharing a thin old wall of this ski-bum hotel with the room reserved for the overnight staff. He had no doubt heard every terrible sound. I cracked open the weighted door, present enough to feel a tinge of embarrassment, but without the faculty to shift my current heavy reality. Someone died, I croaked. I'm so sorry, he said with warm, sad eyes and a sincerely concerned tone that sounded almost relieved. He had no idea what to do next. There was nothing to do. I closed the door and slid without pause down its back until my bones hit the floor. In a way, my lie was terrifyingly accurate. Someone was dying, me, again, and I thought I wanted to this time. God damn it. In these consuming moments, preferring solitude to rejection, I shove away everyone and everything that I love, or at least I tried to. Some have seen this act of sudden rejection before and have given it the credibility it deserves, which is to say, none. The monstrous cruel coup of my mind is recognizable in the behaviors that it compels. It can be a thankless, heavy task to love an anorectic. A mighty storm simmers just beneath the glimmering surface. We swim in dangerous waters. The threat of drowning is nearly always imminent. Rescuers, beware, sabotage lives here. I know that this subject matter holds not only the possibility, but the likelihood of moments that emit a sort of pungent acidity. The imagery is gruesome at worst, disconcerting at least. After all, it is a story of starvation, nearly to death. I would love for this to be an old story that no longer affects me today, but it's not. I still dance with this devil. The moves are intricate, and over time, somewhat predictable. It's this predictability that I hope to illuminate and decode. The present reality of a desperate time is rarely well understood until a person has lived it, passed through it, and is on the other side looking back, beyond the imminent threat of returning to that place simply by connecting with it through physical and mental memory. The story I share here is now at a safe enough distance for me to turn back to face it, yet still close enough from my perspective to be accurate to the experience. It is recent history. Though memory is a tricky thing, it is fraught with danger and the soft sadness of old hurt soothed by behaviors that encourage amnesia. The cause of the hurt may be long forgotten, still the pain remains. The wonderings of hazy and faded recollections and the absolute uncertainty of truth contrast ironically with the burdensome weight of that sharp ache. What terrible thought does memory keep at bay? What door does it guard? What movement does the heft of it prevent? What connections have been lost to it? Countless. I know this for certain. Creating and maintaining space is the answer. Space and a clear distinction between what is me and what is not, between what I crave and what I must do to name and satisfy the need that has learned to mask itself with propriety and deprivation. Let's get this out of the way. Anorexia is not about control. Anorexia is about shrinking to accommodate the space that you have been allowed to take up in your life. The exact amount of space that you can hold without making anyone else uncomfortable. Healing from anorexia is an act of insubordination, of self-defense. Thank you for listening. That was the introduction and a little piece of chapter 1. I would love to open it up to questions at this point. I could talk at you all night, but that would bore both of us. Any questions? Don't be shy, you can ask anything. Trust me, it's all in here.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the facilities that people who come out about anorexia go to, or the living conditions that are present there?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a challenge. Yeah, it's a real challenge. So a couple places I like to start are, I am not a clinician, right? This is not medical advice. This is my personal experience and my thoughts on another way to look at it. I was court ordered into a facility for a very short period of time. And I think a lot of good happens in some of them. And I'm certainly not here to cherry pick which are good and which are not. But what I know is that the relapse rate is more than 90% across all facilities. And I think one of the reasons that is that very few, if any, are really getting to the core of the why that drives the anorectic behavior. So I think that hospitals and facilities are generally pretty good at refeeding in a safe way, which is also really important, because once you have insulted your homeostasis to such an extent, feeding itself can actually be dangerous. So I think it's important to do that in the right way, and I think they have that dialed in. So kind of retention or regaining of weight, I think they're most facilities are pretty good at. It's how they get to it sometimes is problematic. But unfortunately, I think that the underlying cause, the psychological drivers behind anorexia are rarely really gotten to. And in their defense, there aren't a lot of tools available. Right? So every pharmaceutical agent that lives anywhere within the realm of mental illness has been thrown at anorexia. Not one of them has improved any relevant outcomes. So not one pharmacological agent thrown at anorexia has proven benefit. That's a little astonishing. And only one therapy has. That's family-based therapy, and you can imagine that can be a little hard to get at depending upon the participation of your family, and just not all homes and clinics are implementing it. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, so it's a challenge. They are extremely expensive and often not remarkably beneficial. which is not to throw them all out, but just to recognize that it's a real challenge. Treatment is a real challenge.
What would be some ways to address those underlying psychological causes, like either from an educational perspective or like in certain relationships with others?
That's a beautiful question, thank you. So the question is, what are some helpful ways to address those underlying psychological challenges, interpersonal relationships and education and others? My experience of anorexia was multifaceted, but the most profound experience that sticks with me is this feeling of having a voice in one's head. And this will get to the answer of your question, because it's all about kind of battling that voice and how you do that effectively. So that voice in your head, it's not delusional or hallucinatory, it's fully integrated. It probably feels something like if you have a very high anxiety moment or day and are ruminating, you kind of turn that way up and make it as cruel as you can imagine. That's the voice of anorexia in your head 24/7. And that is what compels the behavior toward starvation and ultimately death. So what helps is anything that weakens that voice or kind of breaks that spell and supports the, as I said in the book, I know that both young men and young women and many other genders battle anorexia undoubtedly, but the rate of young women is so high, I tend to say her. So supporting that young woman's voice and bringing that more to the forefront. So things that help with that are, and some of these are gonna feel really simple. Discovering joy, levity. It's a very dark, horrible place to live. And it feels very real, and it feels like that's all that there is. And a young woman who is dealing with anorexia has also learned that her wants and needs and interests and desires are irrelevant, and certainly not worth pursuing. The only ones that are worth pursuing are those that reflect well on someone else in her life, generally. So finding joy for its own sake, levity for its own sake, and shining just little flashes of light into that very dark experience, as simple as it sounds, can go a very long way. I think one of the most important pieces of recovery, if not the most important, is the complete individuation of the person battling anorexia from everyone and everything else in their life. This is the natural process of adolescence, right? But in anorexia, that process is arrested for whatever reason, and we can go into, postulates around the reasoning there, but that process of self-direction is arrested in anorexia. So anything that supports the young woman having additional space in her life, which is counterintuitive, right? Because you kind of want to, if a person is in a crisis, right, you want to step in and kind of hover. A medical crisis is a medical crisis, and that should be handled by medical personnel, but the psychological structure is that she feels pressed in on all sides, so holding space for her. Does that make sense? That can be as simple as asking what she prefers in a moment and refusing to weigh in with what you prefer, because she will defer, right? That's one very simple way of creating space, but there are others, and it's very important, I think, for her to have that space in which to ultimately self-direct who she wishes to become, because that is an incomplete process in a person who's battling anorexia.
Do you think that the way that, from a medical standpoint, people kind of try to treat anorexia changed, that more people would fully recover as opposed to temporarily recovering and then relapsing?
Do I think that if the way that we approached anorexia changed, it would change the outcomes, including mortality? Yes, absolutely, which is why I'm out here 100%, because I think, while I do not pretend to have the answer, right? The book is not prescriptive. It is an example of one person's successful silencing of this devastating disorder and what I've learned from that. But yes, I firmly believe at this point that what is hindering our progress is the axiom from which we are working. That axiom is that anorexia is about control. And it is a young woman kind of acting out in this way, which really reduces the seriousness of the disorder. I truly believe if anorexia affected a different population, it would have received a lot more attention a lot sooner. But because it affects young women, it's seen as a phase, even though it has the highest mortality rate of any mental illness, or is seen as acting out, or is seen as, some sort of aggressive adolescence or refusal to grow up, or these very childish approaches to a very serious disorder. Reminds me a bit of how hysteria, which doesn't exist, by the way, but as it was classified, was treated, and I think that ties into the need to modernize. And I think once we broke hysteria, the delusion of hysteria, out into what was actually going on, then suddenly we could treat what was actually going on. I think that we have the same peril with anorexia right now, where we have defined it in a way that prevents any sort of positive outcome because the definition is wrong. You can only come to certain conclusions from certain axioms, and I believe that our axiom is preventing the progress, which is why I think the call to action for me is for the entire ecosystem to say, hey, we really haven't gotten anywhere. Why are we holding on to this belief system that even patients themselves say doesn't feel at all accurate to the experience? Yes, I do believe it would change outcomes. I can't prove that, but I hope that we do prove that eventually. Yeah.
What was the turning point for you that helped you overcome your anorexia?
Yeah, that's a great question. What was the turning point for me? It's so hard to pinpoint, right? And there were a couple for me, and the full story is in the book, but the turning point for me, I had 2 bouts of anorexia. One was in my high school years, and one was in my college years. And I had kind of enough of a recovery between them to be able to get to college. But the final recovery for me, when I really started to leave it behind, was a very clear, very deliberate decision on my own behalf to live. And I think that speaks to the aim of anorexia, which is death. It's very, very clearly, one will starve oneself to death unless there's some intervention. And so it was clear to me in a moment that I kind of detail in the book around the fact that I should provide myself at least enough self-respect to decide whether I was going to live or die, not just let it happen. And I chose to live, and I chose to live not because I cared at all about myself. I didn't at the moment. My sense of self-worth was as close to zero as one can get. But I saw a lot of people around me that I adored who seemed to think I was worth something more than I thought. And that, along with many other factors, was enough to start to convince me that maybe I was worth fighting for. But at the end, it was a choice to live. And then the commitment to that decision every single day, which was incredibly difficult, because what I like to make really clear is that anorexia is, there's certainly a genetic component, there's a neurostructural component, and then of course there are loads of social and other components. But to choose to opt out of it, which sounds a lot easier than it is, and it's an incredible journey, is more difficult than continuing the path. But it's absolutely worth the effort. Yeah. Does that answer?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I'm also a professor, so I can stand here with no discomfort and just wait for a question.
So Dawn, my cousin, died from anorexia, and it was interesting to watch that process because she went through 3 different interventions where she was in a facility for a period of time. Didn't have positive outcomes from that. But even through all of that, through the decades of dealing with that, you couldn't talk to her about it. She wouldn't acknowledge it. You're trying to speak to anorexics with your book. How do you reach them? How do you get through that barrier?
That's a beautiful question. So a question from someone whose cousin died from anorexia and refused to ever discuss the reality of the anorexia. How do you have that conversation with the person who's in the throes of the illness? My experience, first, that's devastating and unfortunately not uncommon. My experience is that nothing that was aimed directly at my anorexia was helpful. The caveat with that is obviously proper refeeding. You know, the challenge is, Karen Carpenter, for example, died when she ate, which is tragic, right? So that is a real thing. Proper medical refeeding in an acute crisis is critical. Beyond that, it was nothing focused on my anorexia that ever helped me. It was the focus on the part of me that was completely neglected because of my anorexia. So if anorexia is a voice in your brain that is integrated, it's not hallucinatory, it's not delusional, it feels like you, it's easy to believe it is you. If that's a voice in your brain, there is the you that is not that. And if one can engage that you that is not that, and provide space for her, create voice for her, create joy for her, I truly believe that's the path out. And it sounds so simple and non-pharmacological and almost non-therapeutic, but that was my path out. And again, nothing that addressed the anorexia directly ever gave me a stepping stone out of anorexia. What walked me out of anorexia was having something worth living for, something I cared about enough to fight. And I think the recognition of the distinction between, like I said in the book, what is me and what is not, and what is masking itself with this desire to appear a certain way, you know, that approaches some very diluted form of perfection. So I think confronting an anorectic with their anorexia, I don't know how beneficial that is. I don't know if that helps.
I'd be curious to kind of maybe hear some of your thoughts about like cultural differences in anorexia, if there is even research out there on that, as far as the rates and maybe how those different types of environments impact illnesses.
Yeah, there's some, we need a lot more, but I'll share what I'm aware of for sure. So I think alongside that sort of party line of control is this narrative that anorexia affects wealthy, white, highly accomplished women. I was extremely poor growing up, probably, but I was very highly accomplished and I am white. But that's been found to be completely false and just a misidentification of many things. But that narrative, I think, still persists, which is why I bring it up. That is definitely in the kind of dialogue of anorexia, unfortunately. What is being discovered is that anorexia, you know, I've had questions about, you know, does social media affect it? Of course, but anorexia has been around since social media was tribal gossip, at probably the same rates and the same mortality rate, and it was treated as witchcraft back then. Now it's treated as, you know, something approaching perfection until it's not, until you're dead. So I think narratives have changed, but the realities of it have not. And there's a better understanding now of what's called atypical anorexia, which is the identical behaviors of anorexia, but within a person who maybe starts at a higher body weight or has different body mass structure, so maybe is more muscular or more, you know, dense or something like that, where it may not be recognized as quickly because you don't see the weight reduction as quickly, but the medical crisis is as serious. So there's some of that research being done as well. In terms of rates, the US I think sits at 16 in the world right now, higher in Asian countries, it's higher in Western Europe. I think it would be very interesting to do stronger cultural epidemiological studies of anorexia. I have a lot of theories, but not one of them is proven, so I hesitate to share it. But that's some of the raw data that we're aware of. It affects every way you can splice society, it's affecting those different groups as well.
Is it empowering to tell your story?
Oh, it's very empowering to tell your story, yes. I think it's always empowering to tell your story, whatever your story is. narratives hold power. So telling your own narrative and understanding your own narrative is really important. One of my favorite quotes that I also mentioned in the book is Gloria Steinem says, power is never given, it must be taken. It is the very taking of power that is empowerment itself. And I know that my experience through anorexia was strongly a feeling of being controlled. I go more into it in the book, but I was raised in a very strict religion as a child that cared a lot about everything women did. Didn't care that much about what men do, but a lot about what women do. And my father is a diagnosed, this is not my claim, he's a diagnosed narcissistic sociopath. So I had a lot of power taken from me in childhood, and I absolutely attribute that to part of my development of anorexia. And I think part of my recovery, a significant part of my recovery, was recovering and as much self-determination as I should have, as anyone should have. So I think that the recovery of power, like from which to live and survive, not some weird raw accumulation of power, right? But self-empowerment is crucial for both recovery from anorexia and just living a fully fulfilled life. And telling my story was part of my understanding how that power was taken and how I might be able to regain, what was always rightfully mine. But I think telling one story is always empowering.
You said that, I remember you saying that women struggle with anorexia higher than men. Are the reasons different, and what's the healing like for men versus women?
It is such a good question. I'm so women are affected at a rate of 10 to 1 versus men, and the question is, how is the experience different for men? I'm very conscious in my book, or conscientious rather, to be aware of what I do know and what I don't, and to speak with confidence only within the space of what I do know, and to be very clear if I'm postulating or considering other information and putting something forward when I don't know for sure. I think that's really important when you start to tread into like therapies and treatments and what should and shouldn't be done, right? So I feel like the young man's experience, though I have several dear male friends who either did or are currently battling anorexia, I feel like I don't know that intrinsically the way that I do the young woman's experience, and how that ties into the legacy of discrimination against women, which was a significant part of my experience. So I'm careful to not tell a story that isn't mine. I also did that really carefully with the others who appear in my book, my family and friends, and I tried to stop as soon as I could into their story to only as much as was relevant for my telling my story. So the short answer to that is, I imagine there are a lot of parallels, but I don't feel like I'm the right person to tell that story, if that's fair. I hope that story gets told. Yeah.
What was your catalyst for writing the book?
Oh, I love that question. Thank you. So the catalyst for writing the book was, as I say, I didn't start out writing a book. So I started out writing to understand how I got myself to the place that I did, which was near death twice, to ensure that I would never do that again. I recovered to a point that felt to me at the time in my early 20s like recovery, and I was good and moving on with my life. And then that voice and these persistent thoughts kept kind of creeping in, to the point that I realized I couldn't take for granted my recovery, and that I needed to get really clear about on what ground that stood and what might prevent the full recovery or cause relapse. So I started writing just to understand myself. And I think that's why the book is so deeply personal, because I really was just writing for myself. I had no sense anyone would ever read it. The writing took 10 years, and about halfway through, I had an experience at a writing retreat where a number of folks said, "You've got a book here that could help people." So I changed the tone, so I wasn't just writing for myself, but was cognizant of a reader. Integrated, I kind of had these two different voices working in the book. I had myself when I was sick, and kind of what I call my me only smarter. We all have that person, right? You're like, hey, there's a wisdom, like I wish I could have that all the time. I was kind of writing from these two different perspectives. So I integrated them, first within myself, and then within the narrative. That took a couple of years. And then kind of added in the information that I knew intrinsically, but the reader would need to know, and then it became a book. But so that's the full story of the book. But to answer your question, I wrote to understand how I got myself to that place. And I think that still permeates the book and why it's so personal, because it never occurred to me anyone was going to read it, and then when it came time, I just didn't remove those parts.
So Donna, I want to try to draw a parallel, and I don't know if it works,
Okay.
but
Let's try it.
so I recently read this book. It's called The Body Keeps the Score,
Yeah.
and it was written by a psychiatrist that started his career treating. Well, my wife's corrected me, but
As a white male psychiatrist.
white male psychiatrist, but he started off treating Vietnam vets for trauma. And one of the things he discovered was that yoga actually worked as a very successful way of treating trauma. And you'd mentioned, you're a certified yoga instructor. Was that a tool that you used to create space? Because you're saying space was essential to be able to work towards getting past that. So.
Great question. In the context of the beautiful book, The Body Keeps the Score, a psychiatrist who came upon yoga as treatment for PTSD in veterans, and did yoga help me, oh my gosh, enormously. Yeah, and I believe that creation of space for oneself, which usually, it's why I liken it to the power conversation. You usually don't have enough space because something or someone has encroached. It's not as though you're just sitting here with all this other potential extra space and you're just not floating into it. Like, that's not how it works. You're gonna have to push things out of you. You're gonna learn what's in your way as soon as you start deciding to take your space. But I think space is critical to healing, and yoga was a huge part of my journey, fundamental. So I started in yoga at the age of 15 as essentially with the onset of anorexia, and I hated it. Absolutely hated it. I thought it was awful. And the reason I thought it was awful is because it kept me completely focused for whatever amount of time I was on my mat on my despicable body. And I hated that experience. But after each session, I felt remarkably better. And I couldn't ignore that. So I kept going, partly because I had to, because it was parental, but also because I liked how I felt afterward, even though I did not enjoy the experience itself. And eventually it got me. And I think what I started to learn to love about it was that I had this delineated mat space. And people weren't even allowed to step on the mat, right? That's inconsiderate in a yoga class. You don't step on someone's mat. So I had this defined space in which I could do anything I needed, because the teacher said I could, and no one encroached on that space during that time. And I found that to be so physically liberating and ultimately so psychologically liberating once I kind of got into the movement of yoga, that it became something I was really obsessed with in the end. And even in the bio intro, you'll notice it's not Lure from her writing chair. I never sit in a chair when I'm writing. My writing mat, I always write from my yoga mat. And I think it's my delineation of this rectangle of space in the world that nothing can touch, and that I can do what I need to do within that space. To say nothing of the physical and psychological process of yoga itself, right, which is also incredibly powerful and beautiful. And what I say in the book is it doesn't have to be yoga, that it can be any. I think physical activity is very, very valuable just because there's suddenly this communication between these, thank you Descartes for the dualism that's not real, that we're still working through, but there's suddenly communication across this perception of dualism between your mind and your body that is difficult, I think, to get otherwise. For me, it was yoga and a few other activities, but I think anything that really engages you in hearing the voice of your body, which ultimately started to quiet the voice of anorexia for me. I could speak to it for hours, but yoga was really fundamental to my experience. But I think it could be any number of activities that yield similar benefits. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you think societal expectations and scrutiny of women could be a reason as to why there is no proportionate rate of women with anorexia versus men?
Yes, 100%, and I'll dive into that. So the question is, do I think that societal expectations on women could be one of the factors as to why the rates of anorexia in women are so much higher than in men? Yes, 100%. Like I say, I had interesting pressures on my life, religion, this incredible space-taking narcissist in my world. But I firmly believe that society alone is enough to trigger anorexia. If the genetics are there, the neurostructures are there, I absolutely believe we get plenty of information socially to come to the conclusion that we would be better off shrinking in every way that a person can shrink. So psychologically, sociologically, physically, intellectually, I think we are, as women, constantly encouraged to do that. And we get positive feedback for doing that. And so it feels like you're constantly a battle if you choose not to do that, like it's exhausting. I know we're right at time, but I'll share one more quick story that I think gives some validity to your question and my answer to your question. So during this tour, I had the great pleasure of sitting in conversation on a fireside chat with Dr. Amy Cuddy. Dr. Amy Cuddy is a Harvard social psychologist who is most famous for her TED Talk, which is the second most watched TED Talk in the history of TED, on power posing. You all seen this? Everyone's seen this, right? Okay. She's amazing. She's as lovely a person as you assume she is. She also had a TBI at one point in her academic career, which created a whole kind of physical and psychological trauma she got to walk back from, and had intense expectations parentally as a child. So we have a lot in common. We've become dear friends over the years, but she does incredible research at Harvard on the literal physical process of taking up space. It's interesting because we've never really had this shared conversation, but we did earlier this month. So she and her colleagues recently completed a study out of really their curiosity around how stereotypes are set in terms of how women should be in the world and how men should be in the world. Research understands that your stereotypes are set by about the age of 5. So by the age of 5, you're clear about all the stereotypes you need to navigate your world. So they did research on 4-year-olds and 6-year-olds, and they used 32 wooden, genderless, art-posing dolls. Can you imagine these wooden, genderless, art-posing dolls? We've all seen these, okay. 16 of which they posed in very space-taking, open, expansive shapes and positions. 16 of which they posed in contracting, shrinking, small, space-taking positions, and asked the kids to identify the boys and the girls. There was no other identification. All the dolls were identical. It was just how they were posed that made any difference. The 4-year-olds, the majority of them chose the expansive figures as the boys and the contracted figures as the girls. And by the age of 6, it was 100%. Contracted figures equals girl, expanded figure equals boy in 6-year-olds. I find that terrifying. I think if you take that integrated belief and you fast forward to puberty, where everything grows, your intellect, your social circle, what you're allowed to do, the amount of space you're allowed to take up, your physical body in so many ways, everything is expanding. Your whole world is expanding. And if you have integrated the idea that you are to shrink, then the point at which you begin to expand whether or not you want to, that's a terrifying point in life. And I think that has something, I feel like it must have something to do, alongside many other factors, of those who have the genetic predisposition and the neurobiological structures that are different in the anorectic brain pre and post-clinical. I think that alone can be a pretty profound trigger. If you've already integrated the idea that you are supposed to be this smaller contracted form in so many ways, not just physically. Does that make sense? Yeah, so I think it's a huge component. I think it's no secret, it's no surprise that anorexia and what it requires in terms of its behavior aligns so profoundly with women. There's no other mental illness with that kind of ratio
10-1, not even. I think the closest we get otherwise is 2-1. It's profoundly distinct, and there aren't very many medical issues of any kind, unless it literally is organ-based, that have such a distinction. So I think ignoring the fact that it might have something to do with women in society is really just silly, frankly. Thank you, Montana State University and the Honors Presents program for the very warm welcome and the insightful conversation. It's been such a pleasure. Remember, you are enough.